This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions.
Well, out there in Archaeology Podcast land, this is Dr. Alan Garfinkel, been doing this for a few years, and we are blessed and honored to have Dr. Van Gelder to do the Rock Art Podcast with us today. Patching in all the way from New Zealand. Can you imagine? Leslie, are you there?
I am. What a pleasure.
And I'm, of course, recording from someplace near and dear to your heart, Bakersfield, California.
It sounds warmer and sunnier than here.
It is warmer and sunnier than both what the host is doing and what you're doing, Doctor. So, tell me a bit. This is the million-dollar question. How did you ever get involved in the study of rock art and the specific subject matter and geographical focus that you have been recognized for?
This is one of those stories where you want to warn graduate students, kids, don't follow this path, sort of thing. I always feel like I need to come with a disclaimer because
there's a disclaimer, right? Yeah.
I didn't follow the traditional route. So my background was I was doing a PhD in place studies before that was a discipline. And I was really interested in cultures that value place more than time, and cultures and how they educate. And when I was in graduate school, I ended up meeting my late husband, Kevin Sharp. And Kevin had been really interested in finger flutings. And he came at them also from a completely different angle, where he had gotten involved in the research in Australia in a cave called Cunalda. And he had gotten involved because his first wife was an artist. And a local archaeologist, this was in the 70s, local archaeologist needed someone to draw some of the objects that they were finding. And so Kevin and Christine got invited out to do work out in Cunalda, which is 16 hours drive these days from Adelaide, just to tell you how remote it is. Yeah. And they spent a couple summers out there. And Kevin's job was to be hard labor. And he was actually called Mr. Christine, I think, for the first year instead of himself, which he swallowed that. But the upper chamber of Cunalda is filled with finger flutings. Extraordinary place. And Kevin was a mathematician, and he had a real systems thinking mind. And so he was completely taken and obsessed, I have to say, with what is this? And what is the repetition about? What are the lines about? So he spent really the next 20 years trying to understand that and trying to get access to a site where he could study. So just about the point where we met in 2000, he had gotten access to Rouffignac Cave in France. And the idea was to try to develop a methodology for studying these finger flutings, because no one had ever really methodically studied them, to see what could we say about them. So I brought an anthropology and hunter-gatherer mindset, and Kevin brought a mathematician's precision, if you will. And so the two of us came together to try to understand what could we possibly understand, or what questions could we ask that were answerable. We made a deal, and our guide who worked with us in Rouffignac always says he sat in the middle of our marriage, because you can imagine a couple who do this sort of work but come from very different directions. And he used to love watching the two of us figure stuff out. And we made a pact that we would only ask questions we could answer. And we would only ask questions that were answerable. And so that actually helped discipline us, because, as you will know only too well, our subject area is often filled with people who would love to speculate on all kinds of things. And so we stayed very disciplined as a result. And it really helped guide how can we ask these questions? And we both had different big questions about the finger flutings. But it narrowed us down to asking answerable questions, which in the long term led to great stuff.
Why don't you jump in and define what the finger flutings are for those of us that have only recently touched upon that subject matter?
It is a very tiny corner of the world of rock art. It's about as obscure as they come, really. Somebody told me I was the world's expert on this, and I said, it's because no one else wants to study it.
Oh my God. That's fabulous. Fabulous, Leslie. Fabulous.
It's true, though. It's true. Finger flutings are lines people drew with their hands on the walls of caves, in the soft surfaces of the caves. So many of the caves in Europe that are limestone caves have a precipitate that's called moon milk. It's a very romantic sounding name. And moon milk is, if you mixed talcum powder and wet concrete, you would get moon milk. So it naturally occurs and it's touchable. But once you touch it, you mark it. So when the people in the past marked the caves, they marked it for eternity in a sense. Wow. And today, if I were to stumble while studying, I would mark the caves as well. And so patina forms over time in the caves naturally. And it's one of the ways we can tell old finger flutings from more modern finger flutings or graffiti. But the beauty of finger flutings, which is different than all of the gorgeous figurative art, is that they hold the information from our bodies. So we were able to use people's marks that they made with their hands to try to work out who's who. And that became really at the heart of the work, because Kevin's essential question was, is this writing? So was this a form of proto-communication? Was this writing? And my question was, my backup question was, you can't ask the question of, is this writing, without asking who wrote this?
Who wrote it?
Yeah, because if you see a huge collection of lines and they were all done by one person, that tells you one thing. If they were done by 100 people and each person made one line in that 100, then you have to ask different questions about how one produces writing.
And it tells you something very different, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so it led us down. So we agreed to this path. Kevin, potentially more reluctantly, I have to say.
Let me jump in for a quick question. How old are they?
Good question. So we don't know for sure, because no finger flutings have ever been dated just as the finger flutings themselves. And one of my hopes is, in the project I'm currently involved in, that we might be able to get some dates for the first time. But the caves in which finger flutings occur, there is art that goes back to 42,000 years ago. We know there's definitely a period. So Rouffignac Cave, for instance, has some finger flutings in it, or animals that are drawn in the same way. A lot of the caves seem to be in that early, I would say, Aurignacian and Solutrean phases. And in the Gravettian, we see lots of hand stencils and lots of finger flutings. So I'm comfortable saying between 24 and 27,000 years ago, people are definitely doing this. And we also find them in caves that are younger. So 17,000, 12,000, and then we don't see them again. So they disappear. And I don't know why, because it's the easiest form of marking to make. And yet it doesn't appear in later rock art, to my knowledge.
So the tradition just terminates and we don't find it any longer.
Possibly, or it's been deteriorated in different parts of the world.
Yes,
which
gotcha.
I suspect is possibly the case and not all of the caves that have finger flutings have been studied. So there are some in more tropical parts of the world. For years and years, people didn't record the finger flutings because Abby Broy once referred to them, I think, as parasite lines. And somebody else called them the intestines of the underworld, which is my favorite.
Oh, my word.
And art restorers actually removed them from a couple of caves because they got in the way of the figurative art. So it's only been in the last 25 years that finger flutings, like I said, it's the niche, the thing no one wanted to study. The French always say that they're enigmatic, which I love. It just means we don't know what that means, but they're there. So we'll let them be there. And some people thought that it was how humans discovered drawing, by drawing finger flutings first and then from them emerging to draw animals. I don't personally believe that, but there was a theory around that. So they were always put in the oldest dating category.
Now, you've been associated with some rather radical and revolutionary discoveries regarding this particular manifestation, haven't you?
A little bit by accident. And that's why I say graduate students, don't try this at home. You never set out to, I'm probably not normal in the world of archaeology because I didn't come into the subject with the great desire to have the great discovery. I came from the humanities and I work in conservation and heritage. So I'm a little adjacent is probably the right term. But with that said, what happened was we started studying the marks that people were made with their hands. And we were looking at modern hands to try to get an understanding of, we could work out the measurements that 3 fingers of a set of lines made. But we didn't know, lots of them looked small. And so one of the things that we started to notice was that there were small ones and there were larger ones. So we went out and studied adults and children and older people, tried to get a range and did some degree of doing that around the world. Kevin and I both had students in other countries.
Wow.
So we were curious to have, so I in particular was teaching in education and had some of my former students do marking with their kids so that we could get a data set. And what we found was that generally people who made a mark that was with their 3 fingers together, if it was 30 millimeters or smaller, it tended to be someone who was younger than the age of 7, and even smaller than that, really about the age of 5 or smaller, younger. And we had quite a few instances of very small people who were making art in the caves alongside older people. And older could be adolescent. We couldn't tell the difference between 7 and 70. And even my grandson, who I used repeatedly, his hands as he was growing up, and in studies that IRB would never approve. People knew how sometimes you have to use your kids and grandkids in these ways. But one of the great things was discovering the mark that he made as a 4-year-old was the same width as my hand. And so we could never say what children's larger hand size was, but we could say we found no adults who were as small as some of the children.
Fabulous.
So that was interesting in its own right.
Let me stop you right there because we're almost at the end of this particular session, but I don't hang in there for you, and we'll catch you on the flip-flop. Welcome back. This is segment 2 of our episode 146. And we're blessed and honored to have Dr. Leslie Van Gelder, who's going to talk to us more about finger fluting. And I think she's going to open up the bag of tricks and talk about one of the other more controversial discoveries. Leslie,
sure.
It's all yours.
One of the beautiful things, we were working in Rouffignac Cave over the span of, Kevin and I worked there for 7 years, and then I worked there for a few years after. And Rouffignac had Europe's largest collection of finger flutings, and they were in all different chambers of the cave. And we had worked out that there were likely children in the cave, and that the children had been in different parts of the cave. But we were also starting to discover that we were seeing the same measurement, that 3-fingered measurement of individuals. And the whole goal for us was, as I said before, we were trying to work out who made these lines. So was it 5 people? Was it 2 people? Are these 2 people distinct individuals? What are they up to? Where are they going in the cave? What are they doing? And in about 2002, some research started to come out around being able to use hands to look at, it's called the 2D, 4D, so second digit, 4-digit ratio. And what that shows you about the degree of androgen that was in your mother's womb when she was pregnant with you. I know it's very obscure, but there had been a lot of research out that was looking at that. It was actually looking at it in studies around aggression. And I was once at a dinner with somebody who was an expert in this subject, and there was somebody else at the table who was highly argumentative. And he in the middle of the dinner, and he said, "Look at his second digit." And it was the best comment ever, because it was true. This guy, the ratio was extreme. And I was like, wow, how cool is that? But apparently all primates have this. And we looked at that research and said, would this be able to tell us anything that can add to the collection of our information to say, this is the same person each time we see them. So in the process of that, what started to become visible was if we applied this research, it said that female hands tend to, if you use your right hand, I always encourage people to have a look at this while I'm talking. Yeah. If you look at your right hand, generally, so John Manning, who did a lot of this work, I think said 80% of people whose mothers were born before 1945, and this is a key piece to the research. I'll come back to that in a sec. If your second finger is taller than your fourth finger, that tends to be a female profiled hand, or if they're equal. And a male profile hand tends to have a lower second finger relative to the fourth finger. Now, there are a whole bunch of confounding factors that sometimes make that untrue. And for instance, I have an opposite hand. My mother had me very late in life. My brothers both have female profile hands, and I have a male profile hand. And the women in my family run very low estrogen. And so I think it's really interesting that I can never use my hand as the example when I share this. But what we were looking at wasn't so much didn't men or women do cave art, because I had always worked off the assumption that both did, because why wouldn't they? But we had this diversity in the set of individuals that we were finding in Rouffignac, and it was interesting. And what it did was help us work out the individuals that we saw, because in a couple of cases, we were seeing a hand measurement that looked the same, so about 38 millimeters, but the ratio of those top fingers were different. And so we could say, maybe this is a different person from that one. And that was our real goal. We didn't mean to open the gender can of worms, which has continued for the last 20 years now on this subject, not by people who were doing work on negative handprints.
Right.
It's a much more difficult proposition because I get to see the fingers when they're very close to each other. So I can see the ratio. Where as soon as you spread your hand out, it gets harder and harder. So I think we are the progenitors of a very controversial corner. And I also don't know why it had to become so controversial, except that I think it offended the sensibilities of a tremendous number of male archaeologists who had never considered that women could have also been cave artists.
Isn't our profession very androcentric in general? In terms of most archaeologists are men, and most anthropologists are probably men. Now, there's a growing number, but the literature itself is covered, voluminous, man the hunter, right, and et cetera, et cetera. So to say that there are females and even juveniles doing this kind of work is, I would say, somewhat revolutionary.
It set off all kinds of stuff, which, of course, never expected. My favorite was I was at a conference in 2010 where a French academic had done an entire paper wanting to desperately disprove this. Sure. And so he had used his 18-year-old students to study their hands. And as I said, there's this caveat around your mother has to have been born before 1945 because burning plastics have changed a lot of the hormone receptors. If you're very young, your hands don't work for the study. Okay. So we had looked at older people because of that, but Manning's work, he had identified this as a challenge. And so I've always been really clear about this wasn't our intention to get into the world of the complexity of gender. But this fellow had done an entire study where he was desperate to disprove this. And in the Q&A, I stood up to respond to him because it was all directed at me. Sure. And the spelling of my name in Europe is the male spelling of Leslie. So he had thought I was a male academic in front of hundreds of people and said, but you're a woman. And the whole room burst out laughing because I gestured to the parts of me that make that obvious. And I said, now can I answer your questions and fix the parts that are incorrect in your study? And so I think that was the first time I realized just how upsetting this was to people.
Oh, yeah. It's rather interesting. And just as a parallel, not to take any of your time, but I have a monograph that I'm finishing up that, again, faces this same issue because a very famous archaeologist identified a particular class of petroglyphs and indicated they are all men. And what I have discovered after 4 years, actually 50 years of study, but 4 years of intensively examining them, is they're overwhelmingly women.
Yeah. You won't be popular. So if you
No, I'll join the club.
Aside.
Yeah, I'll join the club. So, yeah.
Well,
No,
children became just as fraught, really, especially in places where the question of children being in caves also implies that females are likely to be with them.
Sure.
And in places where the culture says that's not true, it then becomes highly fraught. All of these things, which I have to say, we innocently stumbled into in this niche that nobody wants to study because it contained embodied information. And so to me, that's the most fascinating part of it is finger flutings unlock this bit of I don't think we'll ever know what they mean. Instead, it's what were people doing? How did they move around the cave? I've gotten very interested in questions of light and lighting. And I worked with some scientists here in New Zealand, a quantum physics lab, which was just great because I came in with grease candles. And it took them a year to find a spot where they could burn them safely. And they did the spectrum of light for me. And we learned all kinds of stuff about how the candles work. Wow. And then they recreated lamps for me in modern LED that I could bring that are the same color and intensity. And they don't cast a big light. Oh. And the cave I'm working in now requires a lot of crawling. So there's no way that you had a burning torch. I'm not even sure how you move with these little lamps, pushing them in front of you as you crawl 60 meters. But to me, it's helped explain some of the places, particularly in France, where we've got passages that are full of engravings and really intense engravings are often in these small spaces. It's because the light illuminates really well with these little lamps. The wider you go in the cave, you can't see lots of stuff. So all these questions of light and how do you physically move in a space in the dark is fascinating to me. And the hands add to that because we had a couple of sections in Rouffignac where one of the children, a little girl, I think, fluted with both hands simultaneously. For ages, I never thought about that until it hit me really hard that someone else is holding the light for her. She can't be. You can't do two-handed stuff.
No.
And it took ages for that penny to drop, which in her time would have been an obvious thing. But we're so used to having head torches. They didn't have that. You know?
When you analyzed those finger flutings, did you get a sense of whether this was a few people or many people?
Yeah. It actually, to me, that was probably one of the great takeaways of this work. So I had worked in Rouffignac Cave and in Garfinkel Cave in France, and then did some work for a couple of years in the caves in northern Spain, looking at a whole series of caves. And in all of these cases, what was coming clear was how few people had been involved. So in Rouffignac, it seemed to be maybe 8.
Wow.
Where 4 of whom were children.
Oh, my word.
Now, that doesn't mean that the same people were doing finger fluting as were creating the figurative drawings.
Right.
And it could very well be that the people doing the figurative drawings were doing that, and the kids were having a grand time roaming the cave.
I could see that. I really could.
Why not? And they're fearless. They went to the furthest part of the cave.
Right.
At least 2 were definitely kids. It's a section you have to crawl for a long way. I'm not a fan of that crawl. But to them, it might not have been. It was fun, probably. So they don't have this huge fear. And I don't find that. In Gargas, I'm trying to remember how many it was, but maybe a similar number. And again, 2 very young children who were held up. And in one spot, somebody who is not a child is holding the child on her hip. And we have all 5 of her fingers at one point because she protected her head as she came through a section. And she draws with her left hand and the child draws with his right hand. And then you just see the scene, but it takes, you know this from field work, it takes ages to get enough information to go, oh, I see what happened here.
Exactly. Let's stop there and we'll catch up on the next segment. Catch you on the flip-flop, gang. This is a real wonderful interaction. I love this.
Oh, I'm enjoying this too, Alan, I have to say.
Okay, gang, this is it. This is segment 3. We're going to finish up. We've got Leslie Van Gelder, the good doctor, talking to us about finger fluting. So, Leslie, we've had the last half an hour or so listening to all kinds of unbelievably wonderful and revolutionary discoveries. What's the overall takeaway? What's the perspective that you have on this subject, given your intensive study for, I would believe, decades, right?
Yeah, I'm embarrassed to say 25 years now.
Yeah.
I think the beauty of finger flutings is really in our connecting to the past. There's this, when you see the cave art, it's beautiful and distant. When you put your hand up in the dark and you're comparing the size of your hand to a mark made by somebody else 30,000 years ago, there's much less distance. And I'm always taken by that thought of, and I feel that way with hand stencils too. I always find people are quite moved by hand stencils in a way that they're not moved by bison images. And bison are lovely, but it's not, we don't have the same. And there's something about the way time telescopes that the finger flutings get to tell us stories that we don't get otherwise. So to me, it's like a whole collection of intimacies.
What are the stories that the finger fluting are telling us?
Well, that's a great question. So one is that it appears, at least in Europe, that the people who came into the caves in this time period came in as men, women, and children. So it wasn't men's only or women's only or children's only. We seem to have the whole family. There are no babysitters outside. So that, to me, is an interesting bit of information. I think we still don't know what the purpose of them is, but we do know that they're deliberate. And I was sharing with you the work on lighting. Mm-hmm. Doing that work, we discovered how much preparation you need to have to be able to go into a dark cave and do finger fluting. So you need at least one candle to get you in, one candle to get you out, and one candle in spare. And you can only make candles at a time of year where there's enough animal fat to make them with. So I think there's a story about seasonality that the lighting of the caves is starting to reveal, and that we might find some interesting stories about when did people go in the caves and what preparation you've got. This, I used to say it was a rainy day in the Paleolithic, and so you got nothing else to do, so I'll go make finger flutings. But the truth is, for all the surfaces that are in the caves that could be fluted, there are not many that are. And so the purposefulness of location might be more significant than we think. And the purposefulness in general of the people going into the caves, I think it's very few people over an enormous span of time. And that kind of fascinates me as to what made some people use the caves, particularly in their earlier periods. And
it's obviously a familial tradition, something that was carried with them. And what your discovery has been is that this is not a concatenation or some sort of a fortuitous, but something that was very consciously set up.
I think so. We'll never know for sure. There's some really neat research that I'm quite a fan of to help explain the early periods of why people might have done rock art in the first place inside caves. I think people were decorating the outside world for millennia. But I don't know if you're familiar with the work that came out, must have been about 4 or 5 years ago, about the Adams event. And it was talking about what happened 42,000 years ago and why a lot of the megafauna die off at about that time.
Tell me.
And the guys who were doing this research, I ended up meeting them when I worked in Australia. And what they found is that, and it's known, the poles reverse themselves periodically.
Ah, yes.
And when they do, the key piece of the story is that when they do, there's a couple of days over that long span of time where the ozone layer gets peeled back for a bit and the Earth becomes intolerable. And the timings of those events seem to line up beautifully with some of the earliest cave art that we find.
Wow.
Because you have to ask the question, people knew that lions and hyenas and 12-foot bears were living in these caves. So you don't go into these caves willingly. So it might have been a question of whatever was on the outside was worse than what was on the inside in those moments in time. And then later on, I think it becomes a tradition and an activity and a different thing. But the earliest examples, at least in Europe, are fascinating to me as to how beautifully they align to some of those, they're called excursion events. And the use of ochre, it is a very powerful thing, and humanity has been using it as sunscreen for a long time.
That's
and
right.
So really, in Namibia, it's still used as a sunscreen because you have to actually ask the question, why do humans make negative handprints, not positive handprints? Because negative handprints are hard to do. Why are you covering your hand in ochre against a wall? I don't know. And then once you've done that, why do other people see that and do the same thing? And Neanderthals did that too. So it's going back to at least 64 AD of the oldest dates inside a cave. So I think it raises a whole bunch of interesting questions about climate, about people's behavior, and really that the groups of people that we're seeing are not enormous. It's small, intimate groups of people. And I guess I like that part because there's this sense of getting to know them at least. What were they up to? And there's some pleasure in that, I guess, as a researcher, that it's not some anonymous concept. These were people, and you can see those people.
And it changes our whole perspective because we're dealing with families, men, women, children. Just think of how different that perspective is. These researchers, it's hard to wrap your mind around.
Especially because most are doing field work where they get to go away and avoid their families.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, French archaeology was largely, its first 50 years, was mostly priests. So, Abbé Breuil was a priest.
Yes, that's right.
So, you had guys who were busy, to be perfectly honest, identifying vulvas on the wall constantly. Never seen one themselves. When I stumbled and led to wonder, do they know what they thought they were seeing? Because a lot of them look like horse footprints to me. I don't know. Would female archaeologists have come up with the same conclusions?
Probably not.
Sure. But, so the idea of even looking for children wouldn't have registered for them. And we didn't set out to look for children. We didn't set out to do any of that. We were really, in the middle of my marriage, we were arguing, is that right? But as a couple, we worked on this together. And it was so much fun, I have to say. We were very good research partners because we could disagree with pleasure.
Isn't that something? Leslie, you're just a wonderful force of nature. I just love listening to you. God bless you. This is one of the most unusual particular platforms we've had so far, and I am
ratings and
I'm just riveted with this subject because of some of the discoveries and the interesting perspectives and intriguing elements to something that's so esoteric, because it certainly has great relevance to our understanding of prehistoric lifeways and foragers. Don't you agree?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think I just have tremendous respect. When moving around in the caves today, I'm terrified of slipping and touching something in years and years, and I'm not the steadiest on my feet person in the world. And when I look for marks on the wall where people would have steadied themselves, or even just drawing your hand along the wall to know where you are, they didn't do that. So their agility in these spaces was amazing. And if you think about for them, they did not live in a world where they had a ceiling very often. You might live in a rock shelter, so you've got an opening. So
that's right.
To be in a closed room, I think, and if I had the skill to do this research, this is where I would go, is the acoustics of the caves probably were more interesting to them than anything else. And the resonance in some parts of the caves, in some of the caves, I've get other people with nice deep voices to sing.
Yeah.
Because in Fondegame in particular, the acoustics are exquisite. In Gargas, the acoustics are exquisite because they're they're the harmonics of underground water. So they have nature's harmonics are built in. And I think the fascination with sound in the caves would have been extraordinary for them. So yes, we see the residue of the marks they made, but they probably would laugh at us and say that was like the least important thing I was doing there. Really,
Right.
I had a great time.
The archaeoacoustics. I'm quite close with Steve Waller, who was one of the
I've
pioneers.
talked to him about this before. Yeah.
One of the, and we published an article about one of the sites that is rather significant for us. But and I just saw him a few weeks ago. But archaeoacoustics must have been the acoustics must have been so important. And
Absolutely.
as you say, that's really something revelatory to point out to our listeners that this situation also would be dramatically different because these are people that are living outside.
Yes.
And here we found an enclosed space with a ceiling, as you put it.
In some caves, you can't see the ceiling. So with the little lamps, last year or 2 years ago, I got to take the little lamps to Rouffignac, and Rouffignac has quite high ceilings. And we trialed the lamps just in the first section of the cave to see how much light they cast. And it was fantastic because the owner of the cave, Frederick Plassard, just kept saying, this is impossible. They couldn't have used this. It's impossible. And I said, maybe they didn't use handheld lamps. Maybe they did have torches, but even how much light? Could they actually see the ceiling? Could they see? And the lamps, the big takeaway of the lamps, which was hilarious, was to discover that when you're holding a stone lamp, you can't see your feet. So
they're gone.
All I do is look at my feet. All I do is illuminate my feet.
Right.
In the vault caves, I managed to walk straight into a stalagmite. Not long ago. And classic, like cartoon character, saw stars, the whole thing. But because I'm looking at my feet and where am I going? And when you imagine that these people are using a light source that doesn't show you your feet, the degree to which I'm impressed by their capacity to move through the caves is even more so. And to do that with children, to do that with something that might be sloshy oil. And this is where we go back to the using your grandchildren for IRB purposes. I trialed my lamps with two of my grandkids on a jungle gym. They were not lit, I will say, but to see how agile could the kids be when they were 6 and 4. And it was incredible. They were hanging from the monkey bars holding the lamp steady. And I just thought underestimate. Yeah, these kids probably are scarred for life, but that's okay. Yeah. They're 17 now.
We underestimate the agility of the young.
Yeah, we have this protective view of children that they shouldn't do stuff or this is dangerous. And I think in cultures where experience is so critical to education, having kids be part of what's happening is really important. You find examples of kids making stone tools and practicing next to people who are far more adept, and this sort of communities of practice ideas. These things have all emerged in the last 20 years.
Oh, yeah, very new. I think that's all the time we have. You want to say anything as a sign-off to our audience?
No, but thank you so much. This was such a pleasure to get to share this with you.
I enjoyed this thoroughly, Leslie.
Me too.
God bless. See you all on the flip-flop, gang. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. Find show notes and contact information at www.arcpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.